Değerli katılımcılarımız tekrar hoş geldiniz webinar serisinin ikinci webinarına. Göstermiş olduğunuz yoğun ilgiden ötürü tekrardan teşekkür ediyorum. Ben WWF Türkiye'den Sırça Sarıgöğüş, İklim ve Enerji Programı'nda uzman olarak görev alıyorum. Bildiğiniz gibi bu webinarı TÜSİAD Global Compact Türkiye işbirliğiyle ve CDP Türkiye desteğiyle birlikte yürütüyoruz. Özel sektörde şirketlerin bilim temelli hedefler inisiyatifini daha iyi tanıması ve bilim temelli hedef koyma yolculuklarında gereken kapasite geliştirmeye erişmek için bu webinar serisini düzenledik. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Webinar serimiz 3 farklı webinardan oluşuyor. Takip etmiş olabileceğiniz gibi. Geçtiğimiz ay bilim temelli hedeflere giriş yaptık. Bilim temelli hedefler nedir? Bu inisiyatife katılmak için neler yapmak gerekir? Bilim temelli hedef koymak için gereken yöntemler, kriterler nelerdir? KOBİ'ler ve büyük ölçekli şirketler için başvuru süreci nasıldır gibi sorulara bir genel bakış attık ve bilim temelli hedef koyan Türkiye'deki şirketlerimizden Arçelik ve Brisa temsilcileriyle ve Sentrio sürdürülebilirlik danışmanlığı ile birlikte bir aslında şirket paneli gerçekleştirdik. Burada sizin sorularınızı özellikle panelistlerimize yönlendirdik. Bu webinara geldiğimizde serinin ikinci webinarında daha pratik bir yaklaşımla SBTi dediğimiz bilim temelli hedefler inisiyatifinin teorisinden artık pratik uygulamaya geçişte bizi ne gibi elementler bekliyor onlara bakacağız. Bu 2022 webinar serisi diye adlandırdığımız aslında 3 webinarlık serinin bu ikinci ayağı aynı zamanda H&M ve 21 Holistic danışmanlık şirketi tarafından H&M'in tedarikçilerine dünya genelindeki Türkiye dahil olmak üzere tedarikçilerine verilen bir pratik webinarın parçası. Dolayısıyla bu iki farklı gruptan hani kendinizi burada bulduysanız doğru yerdesiniz, merak etmeyin. Üçüncü webinarımız 30 Kasım'da net sıfır standardı üzerine olacak. Onunla ilgili duyuruyu da önümüzdeki günlerde sizle paylaşıyor olacağız. Next slide please. Başlamadan önce sadece birkaç uyarıda bulunmak istiyorum. Bu webinar görmüş olabileceğiniz üzere kaydediliyor. Bu kaydı ayrıca kullanılan bütün materyalleri, Türkçelerini ve İngilizcelerini sizlerle webinar sonrasında paylaşıyor olacağız. Bu paylaşımı bir Google Drive dosyası üzerinden gerçekleştiriyoruz. Bazı katılımcılarımızın bu Drive'a ulaşmakla ilgili sorun yaşadığını biliyorum. Sorun yaşamanız halinde lütfen benimle e-mailden özel olarak iletişime geçin. Şimdiye kadar sorunu çözemediğimiz kişi olmadı. Şunu da ayrıca belirtmek isterim. Google Drive'a erişim için bir Google Gmail hesabınız olması gerekmiyor. Dolayısıyla kurumsal hesaplarınızda da giriş yapabilirseniz eğer kurumsal IT sisteminiz bunu özellikle engellemiyorsa, ama biz olabildiğince fazla kişiye en efektif, en hızlı şekilde ulaşmanın bu Drive üzerinden olduğunu hani tecrübe ettik. O yüzden bu yöntemi uyguluyoruz. Erişim konusunda herhangi sıkıntı yaşayan biri olursa her zaman için bizimle iletişime geçebilir. Bu seansı bize verecek olan uzmanlarımız Paula ve Rebecca, kendilerini az sonra tanıtacağım. İngilizce konuşuyor olacaklar ve bu seansın da geri kalan kısmı, ben konuşmayı bitirdikten sonra olan bütün kısmı İngilizce olarak gerçekleştirilecek. Ama Zoom'un menüsünde, Zoom ekranınızın altında yer alan çeviri sekmesine gelip Türkçe çeviri seçeneğini uygulayabilirsiniz. Böylelikle simultane tercümeden yararlanabilirsiniz ihtiyaç duyuyorsanız. Bu seans aynı zamanda 2 bölümden oluşacak. Arada bir 10 dakikalık aramız olacak ve her bölümün sonunda soru ve cevaplarınız için bir vakit ayrıldı. Özellikle bunun hani pratik ağırlıklı bir seans olduğunu düşünerek sorularınıza olabildiğince zaman ayırmak istiyoruz. Eğer yine de cevaplanamayan sorular olursa, cevaplama fırsatımızın olmadığı, vakit darlığı ya da konunun yoğunluğu nedeniyle bunları yine paylaştığımız Google Drive'ın içinde yer alan sizden gelen sorular dokümanının içinde cevaplayarak sizlere iletiyor olacağız. Next slide, please. Ben sözü daha fazla uzatmadan bu merakla beklenen ve çok faydalanacağınızı umduğumuz bölümün yaratıcılarıyla sizi bir araya getirmek istiyorum. Paulo Delgado, 21 Holistik Sürdürülebilirlik Danışmanlığı'nın CEO'su ve Rebecca Hughes, kendisi bilim temelli hedefler uzmanı, yine 21 Holistik'te. Paulo ve Rebecca aynı zamanda bilim temelli hedefler inisiyatifinde daha önceden çalışıyorlardı ve bu konuda şirketlere ve Global Compact çerçevesinde uygulanan eğitimlerde de dahil olmak üzere çeşitli eğitimler veriyorlar, vermeye devam ediyorlar. Paula, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sircha, for the introduction. I was listening to you in Turkish, so I guess you already introduced us. But hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here today with you. My name is Paola Delgado. I am CEO of 21 Holistic. Previously worked with the Science Based Targets Initiative for 7 years. And I'm here with my colleague, Rebecca Hughes, also, who was part of the SBTi for a long time. So we really hope today to answer all of your questions and also put a little bit more the theory into practice, right? So today we have an exciting agenda. We will we'll first quickly recap on some very important science-based targets, concepts and methods that you already saw in some of the previous series webinars. We'll also touch on some sector-specific guidance and criteria. So quick overview of what the initiative has developed for certain sectors and how the SBTi is implementing them for them. We'll also have a Q&A part, but please do send your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, please. And then after that, we'll have a break. And when we come back from the break, we'll do the practical exercise. So we'll make you use one of the tools, the one for near-term target setting with a hypothetical company. So after that, we'll also have another Q&A. And finally, we will have some closing remarks at the end. So without further ado, I will hand it over to my colleague, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Paola and Serüveni, for the introductions, and it's wonderful to virtually be here with all of you today. I will be delving into the first subtopic around the technicalities and methodologies of near-term science-based target setting. Next slide, please. As a recap and important contextualization of the technical concepts available from the Science Based Targets Initiative, or just SBTi for ease of speech during the presentation. These are founded in the Foundations of Science-Based Target Setting paper that set out the technical concepts as well as how the global climate science has been translated to be applicable on the corporate level. And it explains how newly leveraged available science has been used to align methods with relevant temperature pathways as used by the SBTi. It's important to note that this technical development and this document has been developed with a thorough in-depth consultation with the SBTi's Scientific Advisory Group, which is a group of climate experts from different disciplines. If you're interested to delve more into the mechanics and underlying temperature pathways and nitty-gritty of the climate science, we would encourage you to read this paper. Next slide, please. In order to translate the technical concepts to different uses for companies, it's important to go over certain target setting elements. The first target setting element that we will be looking at is the choice of a climate scenario. And this answers the question, what is the global carbon budget? So starting from a global perspective, it's important to understand what is the volume or amount of carbon that can be emitted into the atmosphere before warming will exceed certain temperature thresholds. Because as we understand, certain volumes or amounts of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases translates to a certain temperature and resultant warming that we experience on the surface of the Earth. And emission scenarios represent a way in which the available carbon budget is calculated and distributed over time. So these are hypothetical scenarios that distribute how carbon is used up over time, depending on certain assumptions and parameters. Next animation, please. Secondly, is to have a look at the allocation of the carbon budget, answering the question, how much companies should reduce. So this has a look at the allocation or the splitting up of the carbon budget, typically on a global level, that underlies a specific emission scenario to companies. So it translates splitting up a global perspective to a company level. Next animation, please. Thirdly, on the smaller scale is looking at a single company perspective. So from the contextualization of understanding the climate scenario and how much needs to be allocated per company, at a specific company level, then we need to understand how much a company needs to reduce. So based on the chosen emission scenario and allocation approach, for a specific company, how much do they need to reduce compared to a baseline or base year of emissions to keep within what they've been allocated from the global carbon budget? Next slide, please. These target setting elements are reiterated on this slide, where we see that over time, as human activities and industrialization has increased, there has been an associated increase in concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide. From this, we understand that there is a certain volume or amount of carbon that translates into a certain warming. With having a look at the analogy of a bucket, the green represents what we have historically emitted into the atmosphere and has accumulated over time, as greenhouse gases, different greenhouse gases have got a certain temperature result, and they also have a longevity in which they stay within the atmosphere. So from this, we have what's left to remain, so the white part of the budget, which is distributed in the SBTi perspective between different companies with their portion of the carbon budget and what they can still emit. So what we typically have a look at is a carbon budget of 500 gigatons of carbon dioxide, which translates to a 50% likelihood of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. Next slide, please. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC released the special report on 1.5. And this was a landmark report that showed that there is a world of difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial temperatures. So 0.5 degree makes a world of difference in terms of the impacts we experience as a society, as the environment, as the climate system, and as well as in economic terms. So taking a snapshot example that we can see on the slide, we can see that the number of ice-free Arctic summers at 1.5 degrees of warming is at least once every 100 years, whereas the 2 degrees of warming, it's at least once every 10 years. So the selected impact is 10 times worse with an extra 0.5 degree of warming. Next slide, please. And just to contextualize that, as we saw in the previous slide, as climate science has been updated to show that we really need to set ambitious action to mitigate our emissions, that the focus should be on 1.5 degrees of warming and not 2 degrees. So as the initiative has matured since its inception in 2015, there has been a renewed focus on pushing companies to set ambitious targets aligned with 1.5 degrees and not 2 degrees of warming. Delving into the next target element of the allocation of the carbon budget, there's two broad arching methodologies that we're going to be looking at, and then some various methodologies that are applicable for scope 3 or your value chain emissions. This slide focuses on the most commonly used methodology called the absolute emissions-based approach or absolute contraction approach. And this methodology has a look at the percentage of emission reductions in absolute terms is allocated to different companies based on a specific climate scenario. So in essence, all companies across the globe have to contract or reduce their emissions at the same absolute percentage rate. This we can see illustrated on the graph where company A through company D is starting at a different volume of absolute emissions in 2010. And over time, they are reducing the emissions at the same rate. So the slope or the curve of the line graphs is the same, although they are starting and ending at different volumes of absolute emissions. So this method can be used by companies from all sectors, except for power generation that has to use a sector-based methodology we will delve into in the next slide, and is agnostic or doesn't pay attention to sectoral growth or differences between sectors. This methodology is applicable to heterogeneous sectors, so companies that are in sectors that produce different types of products or services, and can be used across scopes 1 and 2, which is direct emissions within a company, as well as in scope 3 across a company's value chain. Next slide, please. This methodology is coined the sector-based approach, or what's commonly termed the sectoral decarbonization approach. And this is a methodology that has been developed by the SBTi and has a look at emission reductions in intensity terms, whereas the previous method we had a look at was focused on absolute-based emissions. And this method now has a focus on sector-specific carbon budgets and brings into consideration different mitigation and technology options and activity projections. So in simple terms, it means that This method has the understanding and incorporates where different sectors need to be as we transition to the net zero economy. So for example, in the power sector, that sector is currently taking up a large portion of the pie and needs to drastically decrease over time, as there are a lot of available mitigation measures and technology options for that sector to decarbonize. This method is based on a convergence approach where all companies need to converge to the same emissions intensity level. This is illustrated by the graph where we are now looking at company A through company C with a sector emissions intensity average shown by the solid black line. Having a look at the difference between company A and company C, company A is starting at a higher emissions intensity compared to company C. So over time, company A has to reduce their emissions intensity at a faster rate compared to company C to converge to the sector average over time. So company C in comparison is starting below the sector emissions intensity average, so has a slower rate of reduction to converge on the sectoral average over time. This methodology is applicable for homogeneous sectors, which means sectors that can be illustrated or represented with the products or services that they produce by a single metric. So, for example, the cement industry can be represented by tons of cementitious materials as the core product that they produce. There are different percentage reduction rates based on the International Energy Agency's carbon budgets, and the sectoral decarbonization approach, or SDA, provides sector-based pathways that enable companies to set emissions intensity targets, which means it will be a reduction of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per a certain metric. So keeping in line with the cement industry, it would be a reduction of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per ton of cementitious product produced. The SDA currently covers 1.5 C-aligned pathways for power and apologies, that should be cement, and will be continued to be updated as the SBTi updates the methodologies to align with the latest climate science. It's also important to note that in the absence of the sector-based approach, because this is largely concentrated for high intensity or carbon intensive industrial sectors, most companies will use the absolute-based approach to set their emission reduction targets. Next slide, please. The other methods that are available is a renewable electricity target that companies can optionally set for Scope 2, where companies commit to actively procuring certain thresholds of renewable electricity, so 80% by 2025 and 100% renewable electricity by 2030. For Scope 3, as we know, Scope 3, there's a lot more complexity and variation between different sectors and different companies. So there are flexible or more options of how companies can set their targets for Scope 3. There's an option to set intensity-based targets, either based on economic terms, typically per value added, or a physical intensity metric such as meter squared or FTE, where the SBTi has defined certain thresholds of reduction in intensity terms in order to be termed ambitious. Furthermore, for near-term targets, companies can also set a supplier or customer engagement target, which has a look at engaging a certain proportion of your suppliers or business customers to set their own emission reduction targets in line with the SBTi's criteria and methods. And this has a look at a 5-year time frame, which is different to the near-term targets of a 5 to 10-year forward-looking target time frame. Next slide, please. The third target element that we've learned about is the comparison against the baseline. So in order to know how to reduce your emissions and what emissions need to be reduced, one needs to calculate these emissions and quantify your baseline. And this is a foundational building block of developing your target. And typically companies use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is primarily authored by the World Resources Institute, to compile their greenhouse gas inventory. And as we can see on the slide, there's different protocols and guidance documents that set out corporate accounting rules on which emission sources need to be included, different calculation methods, and how to put together an inventory of all your emissions within your value chain. So similar to financial accounting, where companies need to account for their finances according to certain protocols and rules around debiting and crediting, for example, the similar ethos and principle can be applied to how an emissions inventory is compiled. Next slide, please. I will pause here to hand over to my colleague Paula that will take us through the next subsection.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I will now present an overview of some sector-specific guidance and criteria that the Science Based Targets Initiative has developed, particularly for near-term targets. So, as Rebecca was explaining, the SBTi translates the available science from modeling agencies, from the IPCC, into very specific and practical guidance for companies to set their own targets, right? So the initiative also develops sector guidance. So we have been talking about the global carbon budget, but also sometimes the initiative looks at more granular carbon budgets, also from different agencies, like for example, the International Energy Agency or IEA. And then the initiative can develop either specific reduction pathways for certain sectors. In some cases, it only develops additional guidance, for example, on the accounting side. But let's have a look at what the initiative has developed so far. So the initiative has developed a pathway for aviation companies. So this is applicable to airline companies, or contracted freight, or even companies can use this tool or methodology for their business travel. So there's a specific tool for aviation that you can find on the SBTi website. But what the initiative is saying is that if you're an airline, for example, you can set a target for Scope 1 and 2 emissions, either using the absolute contraction approach, the one that Rebecca already explained, using the global carbon budget, or the company can use the SDA pathway. So the initiative is currently developing an SDA pathway for 1.5 degrees for the aviation sector. So that's not yet available, but it will come. And for Scope 3, for this particular sector, the initiative says that companies can either use the SDA transport tool or the absolute contraction approach. And just to also clarify that the initiative has different criteria for Scope 1 and 2 emissions compared to Scope 3. As a reminder, currently the initiative is allowing the minimum ambition for Scope 1 and 2 targets is 1.5 degrees, and for Scope 3 targets is well below 2 degrees, right? So when we're talking about absolute contraction in line with well below 2 degrees, that is 2.5% annual linear reduction, right? So just keep that in mind. Of course, there's additional guidance provided in the guidance document for aviation. And one of this is actually that companies need to explicitly state that targets are exclusive of non-CO2 factors, right? So basically when an airline sets a science-based target, they have to include in their target language that they are going to report their non-CO2 factors, that they recognize that they contribute to aviation-induced warming, but are not included in the target boundary at this point in time. And the reasoning is that non-CO2 factors, there's a lot of uncertainty on the science. It's an emerging topic for research. And it's also not very clear how airlines and other aviation companies can mitigate the effects of non-CO2 factors. So that's why the initiative wants to make sure that companies in this sector at least recognize that that is happening and that they actually collaborate to advance that research. So the next sector, it's transportation. So here the initiative indicates that companies can either use the absolute contraction in line with 1.5 degrees for Scope 1 and 2, or they can use 1.5 SDA or sectoral decarbonization approach pathways when they become available. As well, the initiative is currently developing those pathways. So once they become available, companies will have the two choices, at least for Scope 1 and 2. For Scope 3, companies that are, for example, procuring transportation services can either use a current transport tool that is aligned with well below 2 degrees, or they can also use absolute contraction for the Scope 3 emissions. And for this particular sector, and in general for all transportation sectors, the initiative is asking companies to use a well-to-wheel boundary. So that basically covers all upstream emissions from fuels used in the different powertrains of vehicles. And it also covers of course, the emissions that result from combusting the fossil fuel or other type of fuel that companies are using, right? So in that way, companies can reflect any shift of emissions between the well to tank and the tank to wheel. Because, for example, if a company switches to electric vehicles, of course, the tank to wheel emissions will be zero, but there will still be emissions associated with the generation of electricity that will be captured in the well to tank, right? So that's the logic behind this requirement. Now, the initiative also has some guidance on information and communication technology providers. So there's no tool for this specific sector, but if you go to the guidance document, you will see different percentage reductions for various parts of this sector. For example, for network, telecommunication networks, mobile operators, data centers, etc. So companies can use those percentage thresholds to set their own targets, or they can also use the absolute contraction approach, right, using the global carbon budget. For Scope 3, the ambition must be in line with C18, so criterion 18 in the Science-Based Targets criteria document. And this is basically outlining the options that companies have to set Scope 3 targets, which are already my colleague Rebecca covered, right? So they are the absolute contraction, economic intensity, physical intensity, or even the supplier engagement target, right? So there are other requirements that companies in this sector will be, or guidance that the SBTi provides for this sector. So I would recommend to have a look at the guidance document. So there are other industrial sectors that the initiative has also developed or is currently developing either renewed emission pathways and also guidance. So for example, iron and steel is currently being developed. Cement was recently launched, and we'll talk about it in the coming slides. Aluminum is still at a scoping stage, so the initiative is still exploring how to develop pathways for aluminum. And then also pulp and paper, now it's covered as well in the forest, land, and agriculture sector development that we'll also touch on the next slides. But it is important to say that for these sectors, the initiative says that either they can use the 1.5 absolute contraction approach, or they can use the sectoral approach when available. And you know, what we have seen in the initiative is that even many companies in these sectors that have already set targets to date are using the absolute contraction approach. But of course, the SDA provides also more insights to companies in these sectors. For example, companies use it as a benchmark against peers or competitors. So I just want to mention as well here that the initiative has announced a partnership with Mission Possible partnership. And they will collaborate to actually advance on these sectors and provide more guidance to companies in these sectors and also other sectors like transportation. If you are interested on listening to the CEOs of the two organizations of SBTi and Mission Possible Partnership, the invitation is for tomorrow. You can find the details on the SBTi website. So for power generation, there's also a tool. And as Rebecca was explaining, companies in this sector need to use the SDA or the sector approach, because basically the power generation sector has to decarbonize much faster than the average globally, right? So that's why the initiative in this case does not allow power companies to use the absolute contraction approach. However, I think there was a comment or question in the chat. What if a company is already 100% renewable energy? Then in that case, the SDA is no longer applicable, right? Because the SDA will bring you to a point of almost zero emissions for the power sector. So if your company is a renewable energy company and you're already there, you can use the absolute contraction approach for all other remaining emissions. There are also additional requirements for power generation. For instance, if a company is also, apart from generating electricity, if the company is also purchasing and selling electricity, then those emissions would most likely need to be covered by a Scope 3 target. And that target has to also be aligned with the sectoral approach. Okay. And finally, service and commercial buildings. And I think I have 3 more slides. But just to say that the initiative is currently developing as well new pathways for service commercial buildings. But there are, so we will see shortly in the SBT tool, there are already some two pathways, one for residential buildings and another one for commercial buildings. But what the initiative will develop is basically a pathway for buildings in use. So when buildings are being operated, and also it will develop a pathway for embodied emissions, right? So all those emissions that are produced because of the materials that are being used to construct the building, right? So that's what is upcoming. Actually, The one for operational emissions is already out for public consultation, if you want to have a look at it. I think just to mention as well that companies that are real estate investment trusts, if they are mortgage-based, then they have to use a financial institutions framework. But if they are equity-based, they can still use a regular SBTi criteria. And I mentioned before that the initiative has also recently launched this forestry, land and agriculture sector guidance. This is something very new and it's very important because for the first time ever, companies will be required to measure and report on land-related emissions, right? So that has not been the case yet. So most companies are including in the targets emissions related to industry and to energy, right? But now companies need to also account for these land-related emissions, especially when they are operating in these land sectors or when they are procuring commodities from these sectors, right? So this guidance can be applicable, as you can see on the slide, for demand-side sectors, but it can also be applicable. It is also applicable to companies in the supply side, right? So what is different is that now companies will have to set, when relevant, companies will have to set the normal or traditional SBTs for energy and industry, plus a flag target, right? So there are two approaches. There's the kind of the absolute contraction one that is for demand side actors, and the convergence approach that is for supply side actors. There are 11 commodities, as you can see on the slide. And just to very quickly mention as well, this will be applicable for all companies that you see on the slide. So for forest and paper products, timber, pulp and paper, rubber, food production, food and beverage processing, food and staples retailing, and tobacco. But also it will be applicable for any company that has flag-related emissions that are more than 20% of the total of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. That's why it's also very important that companies start measuring these emissions. And finally, cement, as I mentioned, it was recently launched. The guidance has different, scenarios for companies that either dedicate to, for example, clinker production, or that are vertically integrated. So please have a look at it if you're in this sector. Very important, for example, that companies will need to set scope 3 targets if covering purchased cement and clinker, if they're doing that. Some companies purchase cement and clinker. So in that case, they will be required to set a scope 3 target for those emissions. So just in the interest of time, I think I will leave it there. But if there are any questions that we haven't responded in the chat or the Q&A, now it's time to answer them. So I don't know if,
Paula, I can see a couple of questions that you may be able to answer. One of our participants asked if sectoral guidance and SBA approach is available for a company to set targets. Well, Rebecca just answered and the question disappeared from my my apologies.
That's my error. I was a bit enthusiastic with pressing send. I can go over that question and the answers. So if sectoral guidance and SDA approach is available for companies to set targets, is it possible to use ASEA contraction instead of SDA? So typically companies can choose to either use SDA when available or the ASEA-based approach. But for some sectors, there may be sector specificities, as Paula went over in the previous section. So one should always consult the sector table that's in the how-to guide or target validation protocol. So there's a table in these documents that set out line items sector by sector, where there are sector methodologies available around any rules that are specific for how companies need to set their targets coming from cement or buildings or transport.
Thank you, Rebecca. I hope that's clear. I'll direct another question to you guys. Busenas Özdemir asks, are there any studies for the insurance sector? By studies, I don't know whether she means specific guidance or a standard.
That for the insurance sector, they will fall under the definition of financial institutions. And that means basically that they need to follow a different standard of the SBTi for financial institutions, which actually has similar but different methodologies. So I know that there is now a training that the SBTi has developed for financial institutions, if you want to have a look at it on the SBTi website. But in that case, they would need to follow that guidance and not the standard for traditional science-based targets, let's say.
Thank you. I just want to reiterate one of the questions that we receive quite a bit, and we did address this in the first webinar as well, but I'm guessing if Paula and Rebecca, if you could conclusively answer this question for all our participants, whether their emissions inventories need to be verified to then submit a target to the SBTi. It's usually a surprise when we say no, they don't need to be verified as a best practice sort of recommended approach. But then the question is why, and how would the SBTi then make sure that those inventories are accurate?
Sure, happy to start. Okay, great. So for emissions inventory and carbon footprinting or emissions inventory compilation, for companies across all sectors, across all countries, it is a journey where there is a journey of improvement around data compilation, relationships with your suppliers and customers to improve the accuracy. And over time, your inventory calculations will become more and more robust and focused on less estimations and assumptions and more on primary data. And this is understood by the SBTi. So that underpins why the emissions inventory verification is encouraged and recommended, but not required. So over time, as companies become more mature in their emissions inventory compilation, they will move towards verification. But the SBTi treats all information that's submitted as confidential and based on accurate data and truthful data that a company will submit. So there is a level of trust around what is submitted. But during the target review process, where company targets are analyzed to be verified or not, there is a level of investigation around the emissions inventory that's been submitted and if it makes sense for the sector and the size of the company, etc. Paul, I don't know if you want to add to that.
I would just like to add that, of course, as companies move from target setting to target implementation, there will be a desire from companies, or there is already a desire from companies to communicate or to make claims about that progress. And even though the SBTi has focused on validating the ambition and robustness of targets, now the SBTi is also moving to MRV, so monitoring, reporting, and verification. So the initiative is developing a protocol for MRV that will be ready next year. And this protocol will provide more guidance on how companies should be reporting. And a lot of that guidance, I already anticipate that will have to do with the level of accuracy of your baselines, right? Of your base year. If you want to claim that you have achieved certain progress against your target, or if you have already achieved your target, you need to make sure that you're also basing that claim on good or accurate base year emissions. No, so more to be seen in this topic, but yeah, that's mainly what is upcoming.
Thank you. Thank you. An interesting question. Sevgi Ulugöl asks, if we have both renewable and natural gas power plants, how do we set science-based targets? As an energy utility, presumably, or an energy company, they both have renewable and fossil fuel power plants. Do they get to set science-based targets, or what do they do?
Yeah, I think as long as the company has a fossil fuel-based energy production, they can use the SDA, right? So that is the requirement, actually. So even companies that are not dedicated to power generation, but that they produce energy on site, they can use as well the SDA pathway, and is recommended. I know that answered the question.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Paula. I'd like to follow that up with another one related to renewables. Burcu Boran says, geothermal energy is also a renewable energy, but with high emissions. Is it possible to set a science-based target for geothermal producers?
Yes, so for different sources of emissions, there's different, we'll go over it in the second half, there's different databases that are associated with the emission factor associated with that fuel or energy that will convert like liters of diesel to tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So for different types of renewable energy or fossil fuel-based energy, there may be different emission profiles, with some more emission intensive than others. So it is possible to look at fuel switches and different energy sources for emission reductions, as well as the need to account for these emissions from both renewable and non-renewable energy sources. I'm not too sure if I understood the question correctly, but happy to pass on to Paula if there's anything to add.
Yeah, I just want to also say that the SBTi is agnostic of the type of energy that company uses to actually achieve its targets. But of course, what the SBTi encourages is that the accounting is robust. So you make sure that to include all of emissions that are related to that energy source or energy type, and to cover it under a target, right? So that is part of the coverage criterion, that you need to include 95% at the very minimum of scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that's very important for having a robust science-based target.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
We have a number of questions, and quite a few of them are addressed to you guys in English, actually, if you want to take a look. Yeah,
there's a question about when, like, do you need to set a science-based target before setting a flag target? I just want to say that there is a rollout plan for how the initiative will implement the flag guidance. So basically, companies that have already set science-based targets, you know, the traditional targets for energy and industry-related emissions, they will have a deadline by which they will have to add a flag target, right? It depends on when the company submitted first its targets for validation, but the deadlines will be either the end of 2023 or the end of 2024, right? So that's for companies that have already set industry and energy-related science-based targets. There's also some time for, that the SBTi is providing for when this will become available for, so compulsory for any other company. I think that's April next year, but from April next year, all companies that are new to the SBTi and that they will, set targets in the SBTi, if flag emissions are relevant, then they will have to submit both their industry and energy target as well as their flag target in the same submission, right? So that's for new companies. So if you want to learn more about that timeline for when you have to set a flag target, please go to the SBTi website, and under sector developments, you'll find the flag guidance and that timeline that I'm mentioning.
Excellent, thank you, Paula. How are we with time? Do you want to keep on answering a couple of more, or should we take a break and then carry on with the rest of the presentation and the exercise, and then try and answer the remaining questions? What do you think?
Yeah, so happy to maybe go to a break, and then we can also continue answering questions just throughout the presentation to try to cover the most. But we have another Q&A section, so if you agree, we can take a pause now.
Sounds great. We'll be taking a 10-minute break, or 5, 10?
I think it was a 10-minute break.
10 minutes? Yeah, okay. 5'i 10 geçe tekrardan burada olacağız. Kısa bir ara veriyoruz, 10 dakikalık. Tekrar görüşmek üzere.
Part of the tool walkthrough and practical exercise.
Thanks so much, Paula. Next slide, please. So before we delve into the practical exercise, we're going to be going over the step-by-step process of setting targets, first from the perspective of SBTi, and then secondly, delving into more detail from what will happen behind the scenes within the company. So starting with the SBTi perspective, next slide, please. Thank you. The step-by-step process is a 5-step process that I understand has been gone over in previous webinar series. And from an SBTi perspective around the target development, this has a look at step 2, where companies need to work on an emission reduction target or targets that are in line with SBTi's criteria. Next slide, please. From a company perspective, next slide, please. There is a typical company journey that most companies go on to develop and set their emission reduction targets. The first is to ensure that they understand the latest developments and criteria and protocols that are available by reviewing the SBTi resources available on the SBTi's website. Secondly, to ensure that there is sufficient buy-in and the adequate resourcing in terms of personnel as well as budgets, and that there is alignment with the decision-making processes to ensure that different leaders within the company are aligned and on board to setting ambition targets. and that internal knowledge is built around the topic of science-based target setting and climate science. Next, which often takes the longest time within the company journey, is to develop a greenhouse gas inventory for scopes 1 and 2 in a company's direct emissions, as well as in scope 3 for value chain emissions. Together with understanding base year emissions is to develop a reduction strategy around key emission sources or levers that the company will focus on to meet their target. And together with this, to model and calculate different target options based on the methods that we went over in the first half of this workshop to set the most ambitious targets that are available and realistic for the company. Next slide, please. To have a look now at the first point around reviewing the latest resources, the initiative's website is pasted on the slide under point 1 that you can view and explore. And the resources are organized amongst 5 main topics: commit, develop, submit, learn, and background. So once you've selected which part of the process you want to learn more about and get the relevant resources, the tab opens up a list of different resources that you can download. And then you just ensure that you scroll to the bottom of the page. As there's quite a lot of resources for some of the tabs, just to ensure that you are gaining the correct and sufficient information. Next slide, please. Zeroing in on building internal buy-in and internal knowledge within a company. As we noted, it's important that relevant decision makers are aware and involved of the target setting process and how it impacts strategy, budget, and internal resourcing, as it will be cross-cutting across facilities, engineering, sustainability, as well as perhaps influencing corresponding processes on CDP or TCFD. As most decision makers will always be focused on, it's important to understand the business case or the why in terms of economic terms for setting ambitious emission reduction targets, and how industry and country trends are transforming to favor companies setting these ambitious science-based targets. And to ensure that appropriate departments are briefed on the basics of science-based target setting, similar to this workshop series, to make sure that the basis of knowledge is at an appropriate level to ensure implementation and that the relevant colleagues are on board. An interesting quote is pasted on the slide from Kingspan, which is the Irish buildings materials company, where they highlighted that they also liaise with stakeholders across their business to understand what they thought a leadership position on climate change would entail. And they use this for opportunities for change and to get internal buy-in. Because colleagues within a particular business, they are the experts within their field and can offer great opportunities and ideas to break down barriers and to innovate to set these targets. Next slide, please. For the practical exercise and some of the questions that follow, we are going to be focusing on Company X. And Company X is a textile manufacturer and retailer that is headquartered in Vietnam. The company has 2,250 employees by headcount and specializes in sustainably sourced cotton garments. Company X would like to set near-term science-based targets and are requesting our consultative support to develop these ambitious emission reduction targets. So we're going to be helping company X along their target setting journey and taking them through some various key questions and practical exercises. Next slide, please. From what you've learned in previous webinars, what route should company X take? There's two options that are available through the SBTi. The first option A is the standard route, and option B is the route for small and medium enterprises that is based on headcount as a clue. As we learned in the previous slide, this company has 2,250 employees by headcount. So you can paste your answer of what you think it would be, option A or option B, into the chat box. I will pause for a moment and see if any answers come in before I reveal the answer. Okay, I don't see any answers coming in. For the sake of time, I'm going to move to the next slide with the answer, and hopefully it will all become clear. So the answer is the standard route, as this is the validation route that's applicable for large companies, whereas the small and medium sized enterprise route is specifically for SMEs that are a non-subsidiary independent company with fewer than 500 employees. So this streamlined route that offers predefined target setting options is not available for company X, and they'll have to follow the standard route. Next slide, please. As we learned in the first half of the workshop, a key foundational building block is the development of a greenhouse gas inventory, typically in accordance with the greenhouse gas protocol for all value chain emissions. Next slide, please. As we discussed during the Q&A section, there's different levels of maturity as the company goes about putting together their corporate emissions inventory. Specifically for Scope 3, many companies start with a Scope 3 screening, which is a high-level analysis of their emissions inventory, typically converting their spend data into emissions data using a publicly available tool. Thereafter, companies may conduct a hotspot analysis around key emission hotspots where there are large volumes of emissions within their Scope 3 to further build in primary activity and supplier data. And then over time, move away from data based on assumptions and estimations to a full Scope 3 inventory where there is a larger focus on supply and primary data, where the effort to collect increases, the quality and accuracy also improves of the data as one drills down more into the details of one supply chain. Next slide, please. Looking at the Scope 3 screening tool, this tool is publicly available on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol website under the Scope 3 Evaluator page. You can see the website pasted on the image. And this has a look across all 15 Scope 3 categories, from purchased goods and services through to investments, and based on a company's procurement spend around certain materials, certain questions around their suppliers, which is predefined within this online-based tool. Once you've filled in a high-level amount of this information, the tool outputs a Scope 3 screening or estimated inventory of a company's Scope 3 emissions for all 15 categories. And this is the most basic level that's needed in order to submit your targets and your emissions inventory to the SBTi. Next slide, please. Next, we can have a look at a hotspot analysis where the results of the Scope 3 screening will allow a company to see the most relevant categories. It could be, as highlighted on the slide, perhaps fuel and energy related activities, your transportation services and waste within companies upstream, and then the use of sold products and end of life. So from this understanding, a company could drill down and find more accurate data to further improve their inventory. Next slide, please. So when a company develops Scope 3 inventories for the high impact categories, they need to use the calculation guidance of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So for each Scope 3 category, there's an associated calculation guidance document on applicable methods based on particular underlying data, whether it's distance traveled or liters of fuel burned within a vehicle, for example, and cover the minimum emissions boundary that's indicated. And then companies can use a combination of primary and secondary data to build out their emissions inventory. It's important to note that the minimum boundary is a key term and an important concept within the Greenhouse Gas Protocol as well as within SBTi, as all companies need to provide a value for their emissions in Scope 3 for all relevant sources of their Scope 3 emissions, meaning if you have an emission source, you need to report a corresponding value quantifying it. And there is a certain coverage that is the minimum threshold per category, and this is what's defined as a minimum emissions boundary. Next slide, please. As denoted on the previous slides, ultimately to increase the accuracy of the greenhouse gas inventory, companies should aim to obtain primary data or increase the ratio of primary and secondary data. So we can see a definition of these two types of data sets. Primary data is data from specific activities within a company's value chain, and secondary data is one level beyond that, where it's not from specific activities, but involves the level of estimations that you're not going directly to the source. So for example, looking at purchased goods and services of a company, an example of primary data could be the product level cradle to gate greenhouse gas emissions directly from suppliers, and secondary data could be industry average emission factors per type of material or product produced from a life cycle inventory database. Next slide, please. There are various greenhouse gas tools and guidance that are available. You can have a look at the list of specific practical tools to calculate emissions inventory that could be a good starting point beyond the Scope 3 evaluator tool on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol website under the tab Calculation Tools. There's also different greenhouse gas databases from which to source your emission factors, which are the conversion factor from data such as liters of fuel or distance traveled into tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Most companies use emission factors from IPCC as well as DEFRA, which is the Department of Environmental Affairs associated with the UK. So it's also important that there may be available databases or greenhouse gas protocol hubs within your country that can provide Turkish level emission factors specifically for energy and electricity sourced from your grid. The SME Climate Hub provides access to a greenhouse gas calculator tool, and we can paste that link within the chat so you can access it. And that one should always try to find the most accurate emission factor that's relevant for your country, as well as for the product or emission source that you are looking to convert. Next slide, please. So for company X, this is the emissions inventory that they have calculated, going through the process that we have described on previous slides. They're looking to set an emissions target from a base year of 2021. Their total scope 1 and 2 is 6,000 tons of CO2 equivalent, and they've assessed their scope 3 inventory and calculated or estimated emissions data where there are emission sources for all 15 categories, where some may not be relevant. Next slide, please. Yeah, if you can just move through the animations, thank you. Once understanding a greenhouse gas inventory and different targets that can be modeled, there's different options on developing a reduction strategy, and key elements could be around renewable electricity procurement or generation, engaging with your supply chain, changing the way that you design your products and procure your services, as well as your procurement policy and choices. So an example that we can have a look at around procurement policy and product and service design is material substitution, where one can replace material with a lower greenhouse gas alternative, and have a look at sustainable sourcing of materials. So for example, H&M has got a commitment to use 100% recycled or sustainable materials by 2030. And these complementary reduction strategies will feed into reducing emissions, as well as complementing other sustainable linked targets or plans that a company may have. Next slide, please. So question to pose, is company X required to set a scope 3 target? So scope 3 targets are applicable if scope 3 is above 40% of scopes 1, 2, and 3. So looking at the proportionality of the emissions, does company X need to set a scope 3 target? You can paste yes or no in the chat, and I'll leave a moment to see if any answers come in. Great, thank you so much for answering. Everyone seems to be on the right track. Move to the next slide, please, for the answer. So the answer is yes, because the scope 3 emissions are above 40%, covering almost 8% of emissions across the entire value chain. Next slide, please. I'll now hand over to Paula to take us through the practical exercise.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I will actually, before we go into the exercise, we'll quickly show to you the near-term target setting tool. So I'll be sharing my screen and show the tool. Okay. I hope you can all see the science-based targets tool. You can download this Excel file from the SBTi website, and make sure that when you're actually calculating or modeling your targets that you use the latest version. Today, the latest version is version 2.1. And you'll see that this Excel sheet has different tabs. The first one is just a README tab that has some instructions about the tool, background information, also a quick guide to the tool. But basically what companies need to use or when setting their targets are these two tabs that you see at the bottom that are SBT tool, which is for scope 1 and 2 target setting. That means that the targets that are calculated in this tab are actually in line with the minimum ambition that the SBTi requires for scope 1 and 2, which is 1.5 degrees. And there's also a scope 3 tool, which is actually aligned at the minimum with well below 2 degrees. There also, you can see some other tabs where you can explore the calculations behind the tool, as well as the back-end data that the SBTi is using to calculate the targets. But let's concentrate on the SBT tool. And so as you can see, the first part in the tool is where you need to input the data specific to your company. This is where you can choose one of the two approaches that we have discussed today. So the absolute contraction approach, or the SDA approach, or sectoral decarbonization approach. As you can see, when you select, for example, the SDA approach, more cells turn yellow. That means that you need to input all that information. And the main difference is that for the SDA, you will also need to input activity data, right? So for example, here in the case of cement, the tool will ask you for tons of cement, both in the base year, and then you have to also enter the activity data for the base year and for the target year, right? So that's the main difference. Today we will actually, our exercise is focused on absolute contraction. So that means that you will only need to enter base year, target year, and scope 1 and 2 emissions. There's also this most recent year cell that we will discuss later on this presentation, but this has to do with the SBTi criteria around forward-looking ambition, right? So the targets are also ambitious looking forward in case that the company is using a base year that is not very recent. So where you have to check the data once you enter the information, and where you will see the results is here in the absolute contraction approach. For the exercise, you'll see the base year emissions, the target year emissions, and the reduction rates. And you can see, you'll also be able to see the plotting of that trajectory. There were many questions about if the trajectory has to be linear. Not really. This is just for visualization. But then for scope 3, as we also mentioned, there are different types of scope 3 targets eligible under the SBTi framework. Companies can use the absolute contraction approach. They can use the economic intensity, the physical intensity, or now they can also use the cement SDA. As I mentioned in the sector-specific guidance for cement, companies that actually purchase cement and clinker will also have to set a scope 3 target for those emissions. That's why now the tool for scope 3 includes cement SDA. Right, so let's leave it there and let's get into the exercise. I will share again the presentation. So this is our hypothetical company. It's textile manufacturer, as Rebecca already introduced. They want to set a target or several targets for 2030. compared to a 2021 base year. And they're submitting targets this year, right? So what we're asking you to do is to calculate a combined scope 1 and 2 target using the absolute contraction approach. You also need to calculate a scope 3 target for all scope 3 categories, except for purchased goods and services. So you need to take out those emissions. And you have to do it using the physical intensity approach. We have provided you here the garments produced in 2021. This is the indicator that we're using for the physical target, physical intensity target. And we also have, sorry for the typo, but the garments produced or projection for 2030, right? So please use this information to calculate the physical intensity target. And lastly, please also try to formulate a supplier engagement target for the category purchased goods and services, right? So this company wants to set a supplier engagement target covering 80% of its suppliers by emissions. If you need to, please refer to the SBTi criteria. Criterion 19 talks about supplier engagement targets. And just to very quickly, when you're using the tool, in that cell that I mentioned that it's called most recent year, please just input the year 2021. So you have in the chat, I believe, the documentation that you need to complete this exercise. You have a handout with this information and the company's inventory. And you also have the tool, the science-based target setting tool for near-term targets. So we'll give you around 5 to 6 minutes to complete this exercise. Hopefully it's now very easy after the explanations, but then we will come back and we will review the results together. So there's no need to type the results in the chat, but we will actually go over the results together. So I'll stop there and we'll give 5 to 6 minutes from now to complete this exercise. And please let us know if there are any questions. In the meantime, we will also be responding to some of the questions you have shared with us in the chat. So if you have any other question, please do type it. Okay, we're just giving 1 more minute, and then we will review the results together. Okay, in the interest of time, let's continue and let's review the results. I hope you found it easy after the explanations today. It is a very straightforward tool, but of course, sometimes there's still many questions on how to use it, which emissions to use, etc. So hopefully this explanation will help you as well. So the first one, the first ask was to calculate a scope 1 and 2 target using the absolute contraction approach. So as a reminder, this is a textile company, so there is no sector-specific pathway for footwear and apparel companies. So they'll need to use the absolute contraction approach for scope 1 and 2. You need to input the base year, which was 2021, the base year emissions for scope 1 and 2, select the target year for 2030. And then I mentioned that please, for this exercise, use 2021 as a most recent year. So then you needed to go to the section of results of absolute contraction. And then you'll have basically the summary of the base year emissions, the emissions levels in 2030, and the percentage reduction. As you can see, in this case was a 42% reduction for scope 1 and 2 emissions. The SDA, the absolute contraction approach does not make any difference between scope 1 and 2 emissions. The same rate is applied for scope 1 and 2. And that's the main difference with the SDA approach. So the answer here was 42% reduction. Now let's talk about that most recent year. So the SBTi has this criterion C14 that is called progress to date. And it says that the minimum forward-looking ambition of targets should be consistent with reaching net zero by 2050, assuming a linear absolute reduction, linear intensity reduction, or intensity convergence between the most recent year and 2050. Not increasing absolute emissions or intensity. So that means that, you know, if the minimum or companies can use any base year between 2015 and today, well, 2021, right? So they cannot use any base years earlier than 2015. But if you use the base years between 2015 and 2018 for your targets, it means that you still have to provide the information of your greenhouse gas inventories that are most recent. And the SBTi currently is considering most recent inventories as 2019, 2020, or 2021, right? So in this case, because the company is using 2021 as the base year, it doesn't need to provide any more information. But if, for example, we would have used 2015 as the base year, then we would have to input information of the most recent inventory, for instance, 2021. And in those cases, the tool will calculate if there is a need for an adjustment on the target to make sure that the target is still forward-looking. So of course, the SBTi wants you to, you know, showcase your progress to date, how much you have reduced emissions compared to your base year, but it will still encourage your company to continue reducing in the future to make sure that by 2050, emissions are in line with a net zero world, right? So that's why you see in the submission form, you have to provide the base year data And if your base year is, as I mentioned, between 2015 and 2018, you'll have to provide as well the information of your most recent year inventory. So the next question was about, or the ask was to calculate scope 3 targets. One target using the physical intensity method, and you needed to use the indicator of garments, number of garments. So here you had to pick the physical intensity approach, input the 2021 base year, 2030 target year, and then you needed to input as well the number of garments in the base year and the number of projected growth in garments in 2030, right? And then you needed to discount purchased goods and services emissions, because this is only covering the rest of the emissions. And then check the results section. In this case, the answer is 51.6% reduction. So this is based on a 7% physical intensity reduction year on year. And it is very important as well to mention that companies that are using this approach or the economic intensity approach for their scope 3 targets need to make sure that the target does not result in an absolute growth of emissions, right? So even though the absolute change in emissions is small, you know, compared to using other methods, the company still needs to make sure that it implements strategies to decarbonize scope 3 emissions and becomes more efficient. So now for the supplier engagement target, you know, the SBTi provides guidance on how to formulate different types of targets. And it also provides a template for supplier engagement targets. You can see it at the bottom on the left side of the screen. So if we put together all these targets for this company, basically it would read like this. Company X commits to reduce absolute scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions 42% by 2030 from a 2021 base year. And Company X commits to reduce scope 3 emissions 51.6% per garment produced by 2030 from a 2021 base year. And Company X also commits that 80% of its suppliers by emissions covering purchased goods and services will have science-based targets by 2027, right? So the criteria for supplier engagement targets is that the target year cannot be more than 5 years into the future from the date of submission, right? So for the supplier engagement target, the target year cannot be 2030. It needs to be earlier because that's the criteria for supplier engagement targets. So I think we hit now the Q&A section. I don't know if there are questions about the exercise or in general of all of the topics that we have discussed today. Maybe I'll stop sharing the screen. Are there any questions that we have missed?
I'm just looking over.
And thank you so much for the excellent questions.
Well, one of our participants asked how that value was indeed reached, 16,800. I think it's referring to what we showed on the slide.
Yeah.
But
okay, I see. Yeah, so in the instructions of the exercise, we said that for the physical intensity target, you needed to cover all scope 3 categories except for purchased goods and services. So you needed to discount the amount of purchased goods and services to the total scope 3 emissions, and that would result in 16,800 tons of CO2, right? So what we wanted to show there is that you can cover different portions of Scope 3 emissions in different targets or under different targets, right? So in this case, we covered all other categories with a physical intensity target, and purchase goods and services, we covered it in a supplier engagement target. And in this case, we cover 100% of Scope 3 emissions, but the minimum coverage for Scope 3 targets is 67% of Scope 3 emissions. So you can select which categories to cover that will reach that 67% coverage. I hope that was clear.
Thank you, Paula. Well, someone is asking if they could schedule a one-to-one meeting with SBTi to ask specific questions. Do you know whether that's possible, or what, in your experience, should companies do if they do require some specific advice as to how they should go about developing their SBT targets?
Yes, happy to cover that question. So, of course, you can always write an email to the SBTi. They have a general inbox that you can use, but just please be mindful that, the SBTi receives many questions per week, actually. So the SBTi, tries to produce guidance and trainings and webinars where they can answer live. For financial institutions, they even have like a specific blog where, interactive blog where even companies can talk to each other. But, please just be mindful that that's the case, and try to also review the information available on the SBTi website. There's also a YouTube channel with for the initiative that has a lot of recorded sessions and trainings that you can access. And the initiative also produces frequently asked questions documents for, in general, but also for specific sectors. But, sometimes companies want hand-on support. And of course, you can always as well refer to your, the partners of the SBTi locally. So many, like, for example, in this case, WWF and UN Global Compact are collaborating, and they're also organizing this kind of events. But if that's not even enough, of course, there are consultants that are supporting companies on a more, hands-on way. So that's more or less like what you can access. But please let me know if there's any follow-up question to that. I don't know if Rebecca would like to add anything.
Maybe just to add that, thanks, Paul, most companies, if they don't have the internal capacity within their company, do get external support through consultants or the local network, as Paula mentioned, for emissions inventory compilation, which is one big aspect, as well as for the target development.
Great, thank you. I'll translate another question, which I didn't have time to post in English. How can a power plant producing natural gas set a Scope 1 emissions reduction target other than shutting down the power plant itself?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before as well, when presenting the power generation sector guidance, this sector is critical to achieving 1.5 degrees, and it has to decarbonize faster than other sectors. And what this essentially means is that we need to transit to solutions that are zero emissions, right? So, and that is in general where the world needs to go. what does net zero mean? You know, for most companies, it means decarbonizing its scope 1 and 2 emissions, and as well as scope 3 emissions up to 90%. And what that means is that you will have to eliminate the sources of greenhouse gases throughout your value chain, right? So that's also the case for the power sector. Yeah, so I think that's my answer.
Exactly, thank you. And I think timing-wise, this is great because we're running out of time, and we have managed to answer about 95% of the questions, I'd say. Most of our participants have been asking, well, I'll actually switch to Turkish if you don't mind. Katılımcılarımız sorulan soruların ve cevaplanan yanıtların da kendileriyle paylaşılıp paylaşılamayacağını soruyor. Bütün materyalleri aktardığımız zaman size aynı zamanda bütün soru ve cevapları da içeren bir dokümanı iletiyor olacağız. Bu aynı zamanda canlı bir doküman. Sizden gelen soruları SBTi uzmanları veya konuyu bilen kişiler tarafından cevaplandırdıktan sonra bu dokümana ekliyoruz. Eğer Drive'a bahsettiğim Google Drive'a erişiminiz yoksa lütfen bana e-posta ile ulaşın. Bu webinara katıldıysanız zaten ben sizinle iletişime geçiyor olacağım. I'd like to thank Paula and Rebecca once again and give the floor to see whether they have any concluding remarks.
Yeah, no, just to thank you for the invitation and really encourage companies to, you know, set their targets and, more importantly, to work on their targets, right? So that's the real challenge. Of course, it's difficult to navigate sometimes the SBTi resources and guidance, but the real challenge is in decarbonizing our operations to reach the 1.5-degree goal. So I wish you the best in that journey, and please stay tuned.
Yes, just to add a note of things from my side, and the information that we presented today may be very technical in nature and a bit overwhelming, but if you break down the puzzle pieces, it does come together in the end, evidenced by many thousands of companies that have gone through the journey. So definitely encourage you to use this as an opportunity to push a company internally, be ambitious, and also to collaborate within your country, within your region, and within your sector.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paula and Rebecca, one more time. On behalf of Global Compact Turkey, the Turkish Association for Business People and Industry, as well as WWF Turkey and CDP Turkey, I'd like to extend our deepest gratitude for taking the time to be here with us today. It's much appreciated, and we hope to promote the science-based targets in Turkey, the Turkish private sector, with a bit more rigor in the future, thanks to your efforts. Thank you, guys. So that's a wrap up, I think. Herkese çok teşekkürler katılımları için. 3. webinar duyurusunu sizlerle önümüzdeki haftalarda paylaşıyor olacağız. Dediğim gibi bu webinarın materyallerini de e-mail listemizde paylaşacağız. Herhangi bir sorunuz olursa bizimle iletişime geçmekten lütfen çekinmeyin. Hepinize iyi akşamlar diliyorum. Görüşmek üzere. Sağlıkla kalın. Teşekkürler.